Do we know that I'm mic'd?
Go.
I'm on?
You're on.
Hi, I'm Andy Glusenkamp. I'm Director of Conservation in the Center for Conservation Research at San Antonio Zoo. And today we're going to talk to you about one of the coolest fish in the world. I might be a little bit biased. But this lab is our Mexican blind cat lab. So we only maintain that single species here in this laboratory. And believe it or not, in all this space, we only have 5 individuals, but we're working on remedying that. So a little bit about this species. It's Mexican blind cat is a small, white, or depigmented blind catfish that lives in subterranean waters in the Chihuahuan Desert. So there are approximately a dozen, maybe a few more, known localities in Coahuila, Mexico. And I'll show you some examples of fish from localities in Texas. So this species has been known for about 50 years. And some of the sites where it was first encountered, the fish were quite abundant. And at other sites, locals will tell stories about when there was a lot of rain in the mountains, the well in the center of town would flood and white fish would be spilling out into the dirt around the well. Unfortunately, those events don't seem to happen anymore, primarily because of drawdown of the aquifer on which these fish depend. So that area in Coahuila and adjacent Texas, both of those are part of the Edwards Aquifer. The same aquifer that's right below my feet here in San Antonio extends under the Rio Grande into northern Mexico. And that part of the aquifer is largely recharged by rain falling in the Sierra de los Burros. So unfortunately, with large-scale pumping of water for agriculture and industry, the aquifer levels have dropped over the decades, and a lot of the historic localities where this fish was documented are basically bone dry. So essentially the fish no longer occur there. So we went from a dozen or 14 known sites in Coahuila to just a handful where they could still be found. And some of the early accounts from a few sites suggested that they're really abundant in these cave lakes. You know, individuals would report that they'd seen dozens of fish. I've never seen that, but I haven't been to those sites. Typically, when we do encounter blind cats, there might be 1 or 2 individuals per site, which is really exciting. Some of these sites where they occur are deep caves that go down to water level, so there may be a 200-foot deep pit that has a cave stream flowing at the bottom of it, and you'll find these fish in the slow-moving water. Other sites might just be a small, like a well box in the bottom of an arroyo with just a little bit of water and a crawlway where you can find 1 or 2 individuals living in these really small passages. So they seem to occupy a diversity of habitats in those subterranean environments. But most of those sites, most of the time, have fairly low flow water. So of course, if you're familiar with rainfall in the Chihuahuan Desert, it never rains, except when it does, it floods. So some of these caves go from being a site with a slow flowing stream at the bottom and maybe some pools or lakes to a raging whitewater river temporarily. And so it seems like the fish prefer the low flow environments. We don't find them in areas with like high flow streams, but also, I'll talk about it in a moment, it seems likely that these fish have evolved adaptations to allow them to deal with the consequences of these floods. So, a little bit of personal history, and maybe one of the reasons why I'm so excited about this species is when I very first started caving back in the late 90s, one of the first caving expeditions that I was invited to join was actually looking for sites with suitable habitat for this species down in Val Verde County, around Amistad Natural Recreation Area. And we never found them. Several researchers spent decades studying this fish in Mexico and looking for habitat in Texas because we knew that there's connectivity between the aquifer habitats in Texas and in Coahuila, and that there are populations of this species just 50 kilometers south of the border. They should be in Texas. Fast forward 20 years, and a good friend and colleague who's a park ranger for the National Park Service was assisting cavers with a cave survey at Amistad, discovered a cave, climbed 60 feet or so down into this cave where he hit a crawlway. That crawlway led to a pool of water where he observed 2 white catfish swimming around. So most people, I might have to take it with a grain of salt if they reported seeing blind cats, because folks get excited and confused, but this individual is rock solid. So we didn't doubt for a moment that he saw what he saw, and that started an intense effort to document and collect those fish from this site in Texas. And after several months of visiting that cave and another cave, eventually we encountered 3 fish, and we have one of those fish here in the lab today. So in 2016, we finally discovered blind cats in Texas, although members of the blind cat working group, including myself, had been looking for them for almost 20 years before that. So when that happened, it was kind of like getting the band back together. Several of us had worked on various blind cat research projects in the past and moved on to doing other things. Once the species was documented in the U.S., by the way, that was the first population documented in the United States. We jumped right back into it with both feet, and it's been really great. It's like getting the band back together. So that led to a really keen interest on the part of the National Park Service to document their natural resources. The Mexican blind cat is endangered in both Mexico and the United States. And so they felt it was really important to learn more about blind cats on their property so that they could manage them properly. And thanks to the National Park Service, they provided us with a grant that allowed us to continue with survey work on Amistad, some work in northern Mexico, and also some funding to supplement the care of the animals that we have here in the lab. So let me show you what they look like. They're not big fish. These 2 individuals, they were collected in the wild in 1997, and they were collected as adults. So they're more or less the same size as they were, 23 years ago? And we don't know how long they can live. Suffice to say, they were adults when they were collected 23 years ago, so I would guess that they can live upwards of 30 years. But keep in mind, even though these fish are only 3 inches long, in their environment, they are the great white shark. So they're the top predator in their ecosystem. Perhaps their greatest threat from other organisms would be a large catfish eating a small one. By large, I mean 2 to 3 inches eating a small one. But otherwise, they don't really have any threats of predation. The environments that they live in, despite changes in the availability of water due to flood events, etc., they're pretty stable. So no light, relatively constant temperature and water chemistry, and also they're very low energy systems. So there isn't a whole lot of food underground. There aren't a lot of other organisms living in that habitat. And so these fish have evolved a very low metabolism. You can see they're just lazily swimming, and they're able to go extremely long periods without eating. So one laboratory study that was done about 20 years ago determined that they can easily survive 44 months without feeding. So they withheld food for almost 4 years. The individuals lost weight, but once they resumed feeding, they bounced right back to full fighting conditions. So I mentioned that these fish have evolved adaptations to allow them to cope with the variable nature of habitat availability due to flooding. Well, if you imagine one of these deep caves flooding, where you go from a slow-moving shallow stream to a raging river that might be 30 feet deep or all the way up to the ceiling of the cave, these fish more than likely get stranded or isolated in pools for long periods of time. And being able to go without food for months or years is probably in response to those environmental conditions.
I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Veronica would like to know if you know if these are males or females.
It's very difficult to sex this species. They don't have any obvious external characteristics that are sex-based, and we're not about to cut them open to find out. But we believe that these two are the same sex. Interestingly, it looks like these fish are just wandering blindly, pardon the pun, around their habitat. But we've observed that they have a very, very keen sense of their surroundings, and they have a good map in their heads of where things are in their environment. So, for example, these fish, ever since they were collected in '97, they've been kept with the same rocks and the same 2 beakers. And in the course of cleaning the tank some time ago, technicians noticed if they didn't put the rocks back in exactly the same place, the fish were really agitated and confused and swam around sort of looking for their favorite rock that they like to sit on. So it's really clear that these fish have a good map of their environment. Where keep in mind, in the cave environment, they're hunting in 3D, and most of the prey items that they're going to encounter are going to be on surfaces, whether it's the wall, the ceiling, or the floor. So they're really good at searching every little nook and cranny of every surface around them.
If they are a blind species used to being in the dark, do you keep the lights on in the building, or do they seem to be affected by the lights?
No, we only have the lights on when we're in here caring for the fish, or like right now when we're shooting a video about the fish. Otherwise, this room is in complete darkness.
For the viewers that are just tuning in, can you just give us a little background quickly of what these are and their conservation needs?
Yeah, so these are Mexican blind cats. This is a troglodytic catfish that occurs in the Chihuahuan Desert in Coahuila, Mexico. And we've since discovered 2 sites in Valverde County, Texas. They obviously are extremely troglodytic. They live in aquifer habitats and subterranean aquatic waters. And they have a fairly restricted range. They're only known from a pretty well-defined area in Coahuila, and we've extended that into Texas. And they face a lot of threats, primarily due to pumping of the aquifer on which they depend. And that's an issue both in Texas and Mexico. So, you know, it's not just farmers who depend on having good access to groundwater, but there's a whole ecosystem of organisms. Some are quite amazing, like this vertebrate, that that's the only place they live. They're entirely dependent on good quality and quantity of water in that aquifer.
What do they feed on in the wild?
I suspect they eat anything they want. Other organisms that occur in the same environment as these guys include aquatic isopods and amphipods, flatworms, and some other aquatic invertebrates. Like I said earlier, these are really low energy systems as a rule, and so there's really a great abundance of organisms, and the diversity is fairly low. But I would put forward that they eat primarily troglodytic invertebrates. It's very likely that they also engage in cannibalism. That's not uncommon in cave salamanders and other species. And for that reason, we keep our smaller catfish separated from the larger ones.
How big are these ones?
These, the larger one that you're looking at there is about 3 inches. 3.5.
And that's full grown, right?
That is a full-grown old timer. So, as I mentioned earlier, these animals have been in captivity since 1997, and they were collected as adults. Let me show you some more. So I mentioned that in 2016, the first Texas population was discovered. It was very exciting for us. That kicked off a whole new round of research and interest in this species, and with support from the National Park Service and a pretty broad group of collaborators, researchers from Mexico and Texas, environmental consultants and cave biologists, and National Park Service staff. We've been actively conducting cave surveys on the Texas side, primarily on that Amistad property. And so we found this first population in 2016. We've been conducting surveys looking for additional sites with quality habitat that may have fish ever since. And just 2 months ago, we collected fish at a second site on Amistad National Recreation Area. So that was really exciting for a number of reasons. One, we identified this as a potential blind cat site using LiDAR imagery, so remote satellite imagery that can reveal very small differences in the surface of the earth, contour patterns that wouldn't be visible on a typical topographic map. You can identify holes and depressions remotely, which is really nice because a lot of that landscape is catclaw, cactus, agave, blackbrush, things that are pretty difficult to hike through. So if you're just conducting transects in the hopes of encountering caves, you're gonna put a lot of blood and sweat out there per cave. Once we started using LiDAR data, we would come up with a list of a dozen or so potential features that we could hike straight to and check those off the list as either, karst features, caves, potential habitat, etc. The cave where these fish came from jumped out of the data. It looked like a big wet hole, and sure enough, when you approach the cave entrance, the first thing you see is a pretty large cave lake. And diving in that lake, a few months ago, I observed sizable borehole passage underwater going back up under the entrance. And so on this last round, we brought professional cave divers in, and they're able to document and then collect blind cats. And in fact, the first observation, the diver saw 2 and collected 1, and then they returned a couple of weeks later and collected 2, and they believe they may have actually seen 3. So our permit allows us to collect 3 individuals per site. So we're not going to collect any more individuals from that site. But it's really nice to know that now we have 2 Texas populations that we can study and learn more about them in detail. And they're fairly accessible for us to do that work. So, one of the things with known sites in Mexico, in addition to, just the logistics of working across the border, is that many of these sites are remote. And so this second discovery is a really great opportunity for us to really dig down into the details of their ecology and life history and look at associated species and water chemistry and that sort of thing. So enough about that. So this is a recently collected individual from Texas. It's from only the 2nd known population in the United States. And I love this fish. I'm sure you can see on your screen, it's orange. It's a yellowish orange fish. The other fish are kind of a pinkish white. And we believe that this difference in pigment is probably from the prey that it consumes. So a lot of aquatic invertebrates have a pink or a yellow or a reddish color. And just like flamingos that get their pink color from the crustaceans that they eat, these catfish, this one in particular, likely picked up this color from prey it was consuming. So in contrast, let me show you another one. So this individual is from the same site. And he's a little skinny, so maybe he didn't find that sweet spot for dining that the other one did. But since we've brought this one into captivity, it's been putting on weight, and it looks like quite a healthy fish. Just, probably had a bit of a lean period in the wild before we found it.
Margaret is asking if these are the same as the blind cavefish in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky.
No, actually, that's a entirely different lineage of cavefish, and what's really interesting is that we actually have multiple lineages of cavefish. So we have sculpin and gobies, catfish, things that are related to carp and goldfish in Asia, loaches. But the Ozark cavefish is a sculpin and not related to these guys. In fact, these fish are more closely related to other ictulurid catfish. So things like channel cats or bullheads, those sorts of things. And blind or cave adapted catfish worldwide are actually pretty uncommon. You would think that catfish would be sort of naturally predisposed to life in a cave, right? They're largely nocturnal. They have these marbles that they use, for tactile and chemical reception of their environment, but they're not very common. We have a few species in Mexico that belong to different groups. And then actually, one thing that's really interesting that for me is particularly exciting because it's so close to home. We have the Mexican blind cat, which I've been talking about this whole time, but literally 800 feet below where I'm standing right now, we have 2 other species of blind catfish that only occur in the San Antonio area in the same Edwards aquifer. These fish are really deep aquifer organisms. One's called the wide-mouth blind cat, and the other one's called the toothless blind cat. And very little is known about them. There are not very many specimens available. As you can imagine, recovering a catfish from a well that's 800 feet deep doesn't happen too often, and oftentimes those wells have really substantial pumps on them, so you may not actually even find a catfish in the water coming out. But it's exciting to me that we have 2 species that occur here. They're related to the Mexican blind cat, but they're separate taxa, and so few people know about them. So I imagine that very few people watching this video right now had ever heard of a Mexican blind cat, but probably not very many people have heard of the two species that are found under San Antonio. One funny thing is one of the species, its genus name is Satan, and I often like to joke that Satan needs our help. Satan lives in San Antonio, and we should all be looking out for Satan, because Satan depends on the same aquifer as we do, and that quantity of water in the aquifer is critical for these fish and for humans.
Veronica would like to know if you've named these fish.
I haven't, so I generally refrain from naming any of the animals that we work with. Our technicians sometimes like to name things, but if they've applied names to these fish, I'm unaware of it.
Can you tell us why the viewers and everyone should care about small, lesser-known species such as these guys?
That's a really challenging question. There are a lot of ways to answer it. So, I mean, I could be flippant and say, why shouldn't we? But let me say this. So, if you watch the popular media, or if you read magazines and journal articles, you're probably aware that we're discovering new species at a really high rate. So we're discovering new species of vertebrates even, every year dozens of new things are described. At the same time, we're losing species at an extremely high rate, and we're losing whole ecosystems globally. So we're still learning about things while we're rapidly losing things. And couple that with the frequently reported discoveries of human medical therapies that are derived from natural sources. So probably most of our viewers have heard about drugs being derived from tropical tree bark, or blood pressure medicine that's derived from the venom of a neotropical pit viper, or Gila monster venom that has properties that can help with regulating diabetes, etc. I would put, well, let me back up. So we have these discoveries that are coming out all the time. By and large, the value of any of those species, be it a tropical tree whose bark we use, or a deep sea shrimp or whatever, was basically zero before that discovery was announced. And if you consider the rate at which we're losing species and the rate at which we're describing new species and making these discoveries of human therapies that could be derived from natural sources, we'd be fools not to try and manage those for the continued survival of those organisms, right? Discarding them, discounting the value of these species that we don't know anything about right now, would be something like burning all the books in the library that you haven't read yet.
So before we wrap up, can you give our viewers at home an idea of what they can do to help continue conservation efforts and animal care here at San Antonio Zoo?
Absolutely. So probably the most important thing that any of our viewers could do right now is to support San Antonio Zoo's Emergency Relief Fund. We have tabs on our website, also on the Facebook page. Makes it really easy to donate online. You can indicate your interest in a particular project or group of organisms, but those individual donations are extremely important for us right now while we're getting through the pandemic shutdown. In addition, share what you've learned here today with others. Share the link for this video. Talk to your friends or your kids about it. I really feel that it's critically important that people are aware that these organisms exist and what sort of challenges they face. The knowledge that they exist leads to an appreciation for them. The appreciation can lead to conservation actions where people actually step up, and whether that's at the ballot box or with the checkbook or through boots on the ground efforts. If you don't know about them, you're not going to care about them. If you don't care about them, you're not going to help ensure that they continue. But please donate. So thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something new, and thank you for tuning in.